Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, which gets the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. In Series 6, we're asking if and how our human rights are threatened by the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Todd. In today's episode, I'm delighted to be joined by award-winning Iranian-American author, historian, and women's rights advocate, Dr. Nina Ansary. Nina is UN Women Global Champion for Innovation and visiting fellow at the London School of Economics Center for Women, Peace, and Security. Her latest book, Anonymous as a Woman, a global chronicle of gender inequality, has received numerous plaudits and positive reviews. She's also an executive producer on a new documentary about the human rights activist Nasrin Sotoudeh, currently under house arrest in Iran. So Nina, it's really great to have you here at the first episode of our next series of the Rights Track.
Thank you, Todd. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I was really interested in your work, both at the UN, but also the part of the sort of Iranian diaspora, if you will. And I wanted to start our conversation really around the pandemic. We know how it traveled across the world, but Iran was hit particularly hard early on in the pandemic. And I wonder if you could just say a few words about how you felt about that as it moved into Iran in such a quick pace.
Well, in terms of Iran, given the fact that the country was already in turmoil to begin with, everything from economic downturn to high unemployment, COVID-19 has only exacerbated the hardships on Iranian civil society. And far from the regime tending to its people's needs, it has continued to intensify its crackdown on Iranians who are advocating for more social freedom and for more engagement with the West.
So, I mean, one of the big commentaries around government response to COVID-19 is that A, it gave permission to governments to do things in terms of curbing of freedoms, but also some of that curbing of freedoms many perceives as necessary for social distancing, restriction on travel, restriction on economic activity in the name of protecting people. How did this play out in Iran? Were further controls introduced in the society? Were further restrictions placed on people's movement? And how did the public health system respond to the crisis?
Well, the public health system, is inundated. Iran has a population of approximately, I think, 85 million. When I left Iran at the cusp of the 1979 revolution, just to provide perspective, that number stood at 3.5 million. As you would imagine, that the health system is vastly, in terms of being able to tend to people's needs, it is not doing well, unfortunately, as in most countries. This is a country that has been severely impacted by the sanctions that have been imposed, everything from medicinal shortages. And also it has resulted in isolating Iranians from the outside world, even more so during this crisis. As we all know, conflict-affected situations are only poverty. All those are just increased during times of crisis. So Iran is no stranger to that, unfortunately.
What role does the diaspora play in this? Is there, a sort of diasporic network that keeps track of all these things, that advocates, that communicates, and wants to work for reform of the system?
Todd, there are numerous human rights organizations, international human rights organizations that do advocate on behalf of Iranians and their hardships, and they promote the protection of Iranians. But that being said, I always say it is not highlighted enough, unfortunately, by the international community. And given the pandemic, that has pushed this situation really in the back burner, so to speak. Again, you're talking about a pandemic that has devastated an already weakened economy to the point where Iran recently asked the International Monetary Fund for an emergency loan of $5 billion. It was actually the first time that the government had appealed to the IMF, which it has historically described as a tool of US hegemony. That actually puts into context the mindset of the ruling entity. And the fact is that I feel on some level, after 4 decades of egregious human rights violations and abuses, people have really lost hope, which is unfortunate. But when you lose hope to this extent, You hope that it will lead to meaningful change in the future.
Yes, understood. And you mentioned the sanctions. Could you talk us through the Iranian deal, the deal with the European Union and the United States pulling out of that deal, the pressure that the Trump administration was trying to put on Iran? How's that panning out at the moment, and what's actually happening?
Well, Todd, when it comes to the Iran deal, I'm very conflicted, and I'll be honest. On the one hand, the US sanctions are not responsible for Iran's troubles, but they have accelerated the effects of what are threatening Iran's regime, their regressive ideologies, their mismanagement, their incompetence, their corruption, and interference in regional affairs. Now, that being said, I am not in favor of any policies that puts additional hardships on Iranian civil society, but I am in favor of any policy that puts pressure on the regime, specifically to alter its horrific behavior. So as you can see, it's being stuck between a rock and a hard place when I'm asked countless times, are you in favor or not in favor of this deal? It is a fact that unfortunately the key casualties of the sanctions are the people and not the regime. That is a fact. One way to possibly mitigate some of the impact of these sanctions is to perhaps target certain individuals within the regime, target certain members, higher echelons of the IRGC, members of the elite, those who have been profiting at the expense of ordinary people for over 4 decades.
I wonder if we could turn to the question of women's rights more generally. So you work in championing women's rights. Your book is a fascinating historical account of, shall we say, the hidden or unforgotten contributions that women have made to the advance of science, history, philosophy, culture, you name it. The book is a fascinating read. And but I'm curious about, we could talk about women's rights in Iran, but women's rights more generally in the world. And most importantly, what's the interface and interaction between the spread of the pandemic, government response, potential recovery from the pandemic, and women's rights?
Let's just go back to pre-pandemic, and by pre-pandemic, I mean 2019. And if you look at the overall picture, advancement for women has come at a glacial pace. And, when I say glacial, you just have to look at the statistics, both in the economic sphere, in the political sphere, also employment sector, education sector, meaning prior to the pandemic, you had legalized discrimination. There were also the invisible barriers, which I sometimes feel are take on a more insidious form. The stereotypical assumptions that continue to hold women back, and all you need to do is look at the statistics in those arenas. For example, women in the STEM fields, women in entrepreneurial fields. If you look at the workplace, which globally is a notorious battleground for equality, with wage discrimination, equal employment opportunities, and paid maternity leave being points of contention for women. Then you look at the political arena, where the gender gap is closing at a glacial pace. And then you have to look at all the areas where women are being impacted, such as violence, child marriage, inadequate access to education, compounded by legalized discrimination, continues, unfortunately, to hold approximately half the population back from achieving its full potential. And what that means, not only from an ethical perspective, but also from an economic perspective, particularly now that we have entered the pandemic phase.
Yes, and so the arrival of the pandemic disproportionately affects different groups in society. So there's a whole set of studies really around the comorbidities and those that are more predisposed to have a rougher time with the pandemic than others. And men actually fall into that category, men of a certain age, if you will. But women very much affected by the pandemic as well. So can you tell us a little bit about the effect of the pandemic on women in particular?
Pretty much, I think everybody, men and women, have been affected by the pandemic, specifically the most vulnerable segments of society, people in marginalized communities. And so also, as you're aware, the pandemic in many ways has only magnified the disparities with the system. And the fact is that women-dominated industries, unfortunately, have been hit the hardest, and women are losing jobs at a disproportionate rate. But that being said, if you look at this year specifically, marks the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, and to look at how far we have come in 25 years, which, as I mentioned, was minimal at best. And the pandemic is actually setting women's rights and their advancement are at a risk because it has deepened pre-existing inequalities, it has exposed vulnerabilities, not only in the social, but the political and economic systems as well, exacerbated longstanding inequities and decades of discriminatory practices, which have really led to unequal trajectories. And what that means in terms of progress for the global community at large, and how we can all work together, various sectors can work together to minimize these setbacks.
And you grew up in Iran, moved to the United States some 40 years ago. Living in the United States as a woman, as an Iranian woman, what are your reflections on the impact of the pandemic in the United States on women?
You know, there are different arenas to consider, as I mentioned, everything from politics to economics. But, you know, even before the crisis, for example, the World Economic Forum had predicted it would take 257 years to reach economic parity between men and women. That was already an abysmal number, if you would agree. And this figure is only likely to get worse if we do not figure out solid reforms and solid resolutions, meaning that when I look back to pre-pandemic, the reforms that were implemented for creating opportunities specifically for women to increase their representation in various sectors were really narrow reforms, if you would agree. The reason I say there were narrow reforms is because they didn't yield the kind of objective that was envisioned. So, meaning if we want to work towards a more equitable future, in which countless studies and research have also pointed to the economic benefits of equality and inclusivity and diversity, then we really need to make a concerted effort to move beyond the reforms of the past.
And you know, this brings to question the very long-standing campaign for an equal rights amendment in the United States, which did not garner enough support, and you know, sort of went into abeyance in the early 1980s. Do you think, you know, with the Women's March in 2017 after the inauguration of Donald Trump, everything that's happened during the administration, and really the developments taking place around the transition, do you think there's going to be movement for some kind of resurrection of the ERA or some kind of modified form of that in U.S. politics, despite, you know, the probability of success, but just you know, a kind of realization that actually you know, there has to be a reinvigoration of the ERA?
Well, Todd, look, there's this misconception that, you know, women in the United States are kind of united, correct? Please correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're not wrong.
Well, it's a complete misconception. And as a woman who's been living in the US for 42 years, I've seen this countless times. Now, let's go back to the past, because you have to go back to the past in order to make sense of what's going on in the present. And this movement that you mentioned wasn't united to begin with. We all know that racism was, for example, a pervasive problem. And even after the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution, for example, women of color were still subject to voter suppression measures. It's a form of prejudice that unfortunately is still present today. Now, I always say, yes, there has been progress and advancement for women in the US, but the fact is that as a collective, I feel our greatest weakness lies in the tendency to fragment our battles.
Now, I think that point about fragmentation is extremely well made. You know, popularization of that issue, of course, is the recent miniseries Schlafly, where you see the division within the women's movement itself, precisely along the lines that you describe, but also you have a powerful conservative woman leading a grassroots campaign to oppose ERA on more traditional values associated with roles that women have in society. So that fragmentation is real and present, and an obstacle, if you will, to reform. So I wonder then, reflecting on everything we have spoken about thus far, what is your work in the United Nations? How is the United Nations hoping to advance the cause of women's rights? And what are the practical things that are being done at that level to bring about real positive change?
Well, the division that I work in with UN Women is a new initiative. It was launched in March of 2019, and we are required to use our platforms and networks to support UN Women's initiatives that are specifically focused on creating more opportunities for women and girls in the STEM fields, and also raising awareness of the barriers to their increased participation in innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship. These areas are areas where women continue to be vastly underrepresented. And as you know, in the US, like in Iran, there are no laws and policies that specifically prevent women from entering these fields. But what it does manifest are discriminatory practices, the stereotypical assumptions that continue to hold women back in these fields. And part of my work is highlighting the countless women throughout history who have made significant contributions in these fields, but their contributions have either been overlooked, minimized, and what that means for young girls in terms of access to role models, and what that means in terms of moving forward when you hold half the population from participating in these sectors, whether it be through policy and law or the invisible barriers that continue to hold them back. So moving forward, part of the work that we do with UN Women is trying to not only rectify these longstanding barriers, but also building towards giving women more visibility in these arenas, which they continue to be, unfortunately, vastly underrepresented. Part of their priorities is to ensure women and girls equal participation and representation, including planning and decision-making, driving transformational change by presenting more opportunities in these fields, and ensuring quota systems, specifically when you're talking about women in America currently receive less than 3% of venture capital funding, and that is abysmal. So ways to increase those numbers and drive transformational change by addressing such issues that are not, in fact, getting enough attention.
That's amazing. I mean, you've divided out the sort of legal argument. Do we need legal protections, or are they already there? And this cultural, social constructivist idea that actually, much of the access is there, de jure, but de facto it's still being blocked. And the reason for that is a cultural stereotype, social construction of roles of women, etc.
I don't know if you're familiar with British physicist, because you live in the UK, Jess Wade. She's an award-winning British physicist. She became, a couple of years ago, very, very frustrated at the stereotypical assumptions, the pervasive assumptions about women specifically in the STEM field. So she decided to take matters into her own hands, and she decided to make one Wikipedia entry a day. And to date, she's amassed over 800 Wikipedia entries of women throughout history who have made significant contributions in this particular arena and remain unknown. And she's amassed a large international following. And reason I bring up her name is because, again, this is an inaccurate fallacy that women are less capable in these fields. If you recall the infamous memo circulated by a Google engineer a couple of years ago that said there are not enough women in STEM is because women are less biologically qualified. Now, if you heard this in a country like Iran, where is a patriarchal society, you wouldn't be as shocked. But to hear it in a progressive nation and being articulated so openly by a Google engineer is really horrific on many ways and continues to perpetuate such entrenched stereotypes.
So Nina, in the UK, and I know in the US, in the academic sector, there's this whole movement about decolonizing the curriculum, and actually, it sounds to me, after listening to you, that we need to feminize the curriculum as well.
I don't know if you're familiar with the term gender mainstreaming, and the reason I say that is I only became familiar with it not so long ago, which was a term that was adopted by the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Change, which is considered to be the most comprehensive global policy agenda for women's advancement. And you bring this up in academia as to really the term gender mainstreaming adopted as a tool for gender equality, one that is anchored in human rights and does consider the needs and rights of both men and women in all policies, programs, strategies, etc. So this is an important question towards moving away from these entrenched stereotypes, the unequal trajectory which has been impacting really everybody, not just white women, but women of color, impacting diversity and inclusivity at all levels. So I'm thrilled you brought this up, because I think to apply a lens outside of the stringent parameters of the past is very important.
Yes, and I think there's that work on decolonizing and gender mainstreaming are highly complementary and need to continue in that regard. So I now just want to bring it full circle a little bit and really focus on perhaps if you can share some your thoughts on individual cases of individual women who have been incarcerated by the Iranian states. These are successful women in and of their own right, for whatever reason, have been detained and kept in Iranian prison or under house arrest for whatever reason. So it brings, in a sense, full circle. We've really gone around the globe. We talked about the disproportionate effect of the pandemic. We've looked at the UN work. We looked at gender mainstream. We looked at many of other issues. But if we get back to my starting point, what are your reflections on this, policy, if you will, of the state incarcerating women? Is it by them merely being women, or is it by them merely being successful women? What's the motivation here?
Look, I don't have proof of this, but it has all become quite obvious that the regime is threatened by powerful women, women who have a voice, women who have excelled despite the circumstances. You have to understand that this regime has undertaken a concerted effort to enact discriminatory policies and laws against women. That being said, that has not derailed women from pushing the boundaries and trying to challenge the status quo, which has come at a high price. Now, what the regime is seeing is that despite the repercussions, women still continue, right? And the regime has been increasing not only its crackdown on Iranian civil society. I'll give you an example: a peaceful protests, nationwide peaceful protests, which began in 2019. People have been handed even death sentences for their peacefully voicing their grievances against the regime. Now, that being said, you take a prominent human rights attorney and women's rights activist, Nasrin Sotoudeh, who was handed a harsh sentence simply for her defense of women who were protesting against Iran's compulsory veiling laws. She's been handed a 33-year sentence and 148 lashes, meaning that Iran has escalated into becoming a country in which you can't even retain a lawyer because your lawyer will be incarcerated. So trying to block people from proper access to proper legal defense. That is what this regime is now resorting to. So going from bad to worse, instead of addressing its people's grievances, especially post-pandemic era, the regime is dispensing and has been dispensing large sums of money funding not only religious endowments, but foreign terrorist organizations as well. So I just wanted to bring this up so you would get a big picture of this convoluted landscape and what Iranians are up against, especially their women who continue not only to be held back by discriminatory laws, but also by a stringent crackdown in which now you don't have access to proper legal defense.
Well, thank you very much for that. And it is indeed a very convoluted landscape. You've shared tremendous insight about condition of women around the world, under conditions of the pandemic, but also the work that you're doing as a champion for women, working through the UN system, working within a human rights frame. And it's inspiring to listen to you and listening to your commitment to this issue area. So for this episode of The Rights Track, may I just say thank you very much for joining us today, and I wish you the very best.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the opportunity to share my work. I very much appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Rights Track, which was presented by Todd Lanban and produced by Chris Garrington of Research Podcasts. You can find out more about the podcast at rightstrack.org. Funding for this series comes from the Economic and Social Research Council. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast to access all forthcoming episodes and our fantastic back catalogue of 5 series of sound evidence on human rights.